Nearly half a century has passed since the last time a human being set foot on the moon. It is a length of time long enough for those once glorious moments to fade quietly from the memories of newer generations, but still linger vividly in the minds of those who lived through that historic era. A time when the entire planet seemed to pause, breath held in collective awe, watching as one man took his slow, measured steps across a world not our own. Since 1972, not a single person, American, Russian, or otherwise, has returned to that distant, silent terrain. But the most peculiar part is not that we haven't returned, it's that we haven't even truly tried. NASA once offered explanations. The missions were too expensive. The political climate had shifted. The dream had already been fulfilled. And yet, those reasons have never fully satisfied the questions that continue to echo. Because if walking on the moon truly marked the greatest achievement in all of human history, wouldn't the next step have been to go even further? Why then did we turn back? That question, quiet but persistent, has lingered for decades. And in the void left by official silence, speculation has slowly crept in. Some whisper that we found something on the moon, something that frightened us. Others speak of leaked transmissions, of mysterious conversations cut short, of photographs that never reached the public eye. And if even a fraction of these stories holds truth, just a sliver, then perhaps the reason we stopped was not because we lost the will to continue, but because something else was already there, watching, waiting, and unwilling to let us return. So fasten your seatbelt and join us as we explore this mystery together. But first, if you like and subscribe before this video ends, your luck might just take a turn for the extraordinary. Part 2, From Glory to Silence, the unexpected end of a spacefaring dream. In the brief span of time between 1969 and 1972, humanity accomplished what many had once believed impossible: 6 successful missions that touched down on the surface of the moon. Those fleeting moments, transmitted live in flickering black and white images, became immortal symbols of courage, ambition, and the extraordinary ingenuity of the human race. And yet, something strange happened. Just as the dream was beginning to unfold, just as the door to a new world had been pried open, we quietly chose to close it. Apollo 17, the final mission, departed from the lunar surface in December of 1972. And from that moment onward, no human has ever returned. The official explanation given by NASA and the United States government appeared clear enough. The Cold War was nearing its end, budget priorities had shifted, and the cost of each mission had become increasingly unjustifiable. The Apollo program, launched as a symbol of political rivalry, no longer served a purpose once that symbol had been secured. But for many who lived through that era, and for countless others who have studied its legacy, the explanation has always felt suspiciously reasonable. Because if that moment truly represented the pinnacle of our intellect and capability, then why did we abandon it so easily? Why were the planned missions of Apollo 18, 19, and 20, complete with their equipment, crews, and detailed trajectories, suddenly and quietly canceled with no further explanation? Some argue that the technology of the time was too limited, that the missions lasted only a few hours on the surface, and that there were no obvious resources worth harvesting. But by that logic, shouldn't those be reasons to return more often? To explore, to learn, to push past the boundaries of what we thought we knew? So then, why didn't we? With each passing year, as technology advances and budgets for space exploration grow, we are faced with an increasingly curious silence. The moon has remained untouched. And in that silence, theories have taken root. Rumors, suppressed reports, blurred photographs, and voices, faint and fleeting, transmitted across forgotten radio frequencies. Together, they form a picture that looks very different from the one we were told. Perhaps the reason we pulled back was not because we weren't capable, but because we stumbled upon something we were never meant to find. Part 3, Apollo 17. The final footsteps and a secret never revealed. When Apollo 17 lifted off from the surface of the moon on December 14, 1972, it didn't merely mark the end of a mission. It inadvertently drew a curtain over one of the longest silences in the history of space exploration. The three astronauts, Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans, returned to Earth as the last humans to have walked upon our closest celestial neighbor. And since then, no one has continued where they left off. The US government maintained that the mission was a complete success, that nothing unusual had occurred during the long journey. But over time, a different narrative began to emerge from unofficial channels, through leaked documents, independent researchers, and even from individuals who once served in the military or within space-related agencies. One of the most unsettling accounts surfaced from an anonymous post shared on Reddit in 2015. According to the post, penned by a British psychologist who claimed to have conducted post-mission debriefings for support personnel, something had happened during those final hours on the moon, something that was deliberately hidden from the public. The story claimed that shortly after leaving the lunar module, the Apollo 17 astronauts encountered something unexpected, a spacecraft that clearly did not belong to them, its wreckage lying partially obscured behind a low ridge of rocks. But what horrified them most was what they discovered inside: human remains clad in spacesuits that did not bear the insignia of NASA. Instead, they bore unfamiliar markings, with structural designs eerily similar to Soviet cosmonaut suits. Those suits had been torn open in multiple places. Their visors were shattered in an identical fashion, as if struck by force, not by pressure loss or technical failure, but by something physical, something intentional. The American crew immediately contacted Mission Control, requesting urgent permission to leave the moon. But the response they received was chilling in its detachment. They could not. Technical constraints required them to remain on the surface for several more hours. And it was during that window of time, the psychologist claimed, that the astronauts began transmitting increasingly panicked radio signals, describing dark, shifting shapes moving among the distant ridges, silent, but unmistakably drawing closer to the lunar module. From Earth, the control team instructed them to remain in position and continue observing. But what truly transpired in the moments that followed, those last hours spent on the moon, was never made public. All audio recordings released to the public had their final segments cut, and every post-mission interview focused strictly on science, engineering, and national pride, never once addressing what they might have seen. Apollo 17 ended not like a chapter concluded with care, but like a book hastily slammed shut, mid-sentence, without punctuation. And from that moment onward, no mission ever launched again. Part 4. The 1990 mission, a warning from where echoes do not return. As rumors surrounding Apollo 17 continued to circulate among independent researchers, a curious detail began surfacing again and again in private conversations: that the United States and Russia, despite the frigid geopolitical climate between the two superpowers, once collaborated on a highly classified mission to return to the final landing site of the Apollo program. According to several unofficial sources, including testimony from the same British psychologist who interviewed astronauts returning from Apollo 17, an unpublicized lunar lander was launched by Russia in December of 1990. On board was a suite of modern surveillance equipment and a hand-picked crew trained for an operation unlike any other. Their undisclosed objective: to return to the coordinates where the American astronauts had once reported discovering the remains of a Soviet spacecraft, and to investigate who or what had left behind such horrifying evidence. As later leaks would suggest, this mission was not orchestrated by Roscosmos, the official Russian space agency. Instead, it was conducted under the directive of a covert military complex known only as Akatsuki, located deep within a restricted zone near Russia's Far East. The moment the Russian lander neared the surface of the moon, mere kilometers from the Apollo 17 site, Mission Control on Earth began receiving what would be its final transmissions. Audio logs captured the crew as they approached the target location. They confirmed the presence of the old wreckage. But within minutes, a series of jarring sounds broke through: fragmented screams, bursts of radio static, and then absolute silence. Seismic sensors stationed on the moon recorded a brief tremor, as if something had shifted near the landing site. Then, every signal went dark. No emergency alert, no mayday call, no final words. only a zone of total interference, pulsing and expanding across the channels for nearly an hour. At the control center, engineers and officers watched helplessly from behind their screens, and no one could explain what had occurred. An emergency meeting was called that very night, but just days later, all mission data was seized and sealed permanently under the label Top Secret Military Defense. There were no funerals, no public statements, not a single name was ever released. Those who witnessed the event have since retired, vanished, or remained forever silent. But if even part of what was recorded is true, then perhaps what humanity encountered on the moon was not merely a mystery, but a warning. And perhaps, since 1990, world governments have quietly reached an unspoken agreement. The moon is no longer a place meant for us. Part 5. Sounds no one could explain, and things that were never meant to be heard. Space, by its very nature, is said to be silent. In the endless vacuum that surrounds our planet, there is no air to carry sound. And yet, what the Apollo astronauts reported hearing directly contradicted that definition. In May of 1969, during the Apollo 10 mission, the final dress rehearsal before Apollo 11's actual landing, astronauts Eugene Cernan and John Young were floating inside the lunar module when they began to hear a strange sound echoing through their headsets. It wasn't a radio signal. It wasn't electronic feedback. It was music. They called it outer space music, a sequence of soft, drawn-out whistles that rose and fell gently, as if something unseen were singing in the emptiness between worlds. "Did you hear that? What the heck is that sound?" Cernan asked. "Loud and clear. It's like someone's playing a flute," Young replied. The sound continued for more than an hour before fading away, leaving no trace behind except confusion. Ground control at the time detected nothing out of the ordinary, and for decades afterward, the entire incident quietly vanished from the official record. It wasn't until 2008, when a batch of forgotten recordings was declassified, that the public learned of the astronauts' bizarre experience. NASA later offered an explanation. The sound may have been a harmless radio interference between VHF systems on board the module. But for many, the explanation felt curiously rushed, more like an attempt at reassurance than a genuine effort to understand. Not long after, during the Apollo 15 mission in 1971, another strange experience occurred. This time, visual rather than auditory. While surveying the base of Mount Hadley, astronauts David Scott and James Irwin stumbled upon a series of imprints etched clearly across the fine lunar dust, perfectly spaced, running in a straight line from east to west. These tracks did not match the wheels of the lunar rover. In fact, they had appeared before the astronauts even arrived at the site. Apollo 15 was the first mission equipped with a lunar rover, yet the tracks observed bore no resemblance to its treads. No explanation was given, no official report was filed. All that remains are snippets of voice transmissions between the crew, followed by a long, uneasy silence. Across multiple missions to the moon, strange signals, unexplained sounds, and unidentifiable markings were not isolated events. Some dismissed them as technical glitches. Others speculated that stress or environmental pressures might have affected the astronauts' perceptions. But again, the same question rises. Why did these mysterious anomalies only come to light decades later, long after the missions, and only when the files were declassified? And why did they happen? Again and again? Perhaps it was mere coincidence. Perhaps they were statistical anomalies in the great dream of space exploration. Or perhaps they were the first warnings, transmitted from a place humanity has never truly understood. Part 6. The companion object and the unheard conversation. The mystery behind humanity's first steps. On July 20th, 1969, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. In millions of homes across America, families sat close to their television sets, eyes fixed on the grainy black and white image of a lone figure, clad in a bulky white suit, descending a narrow metal ladder attached to the lunar lander. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That phrase, transmitted via radio from the moon to Earth, has since become immortal. But what no one ever heard were the words that came after. When the public broadcast suddenly cut off, another conversation quietly continued, on a separate, private frequency. According to multiple accounts revealed decades later, Neil Armstrong had switched to a secondary communications channel, originally intended for monitoring the crew's physiological and medical status, to relay a different kind of message, one that was never officially disclosed. In that private transmission, Armstrong reported seeing metallic structures lined along the edge of a massive crater, not far from the landing site. He described them as resembling buildings, complete with entryways that seemed to descend beneath the moon's surface. Outside these structures, he claimed, were numerous cylindrical objects, arranged in deliberate rows as though they were vehicles, parked. When asked by ground control whether he had completed his assigned scientific tasks, such as installing the seismometer and retroreflector, Armstrong replied that the objectives had been fulfilled. But he also expressed concern that the beings observing them might remove the equipment at any moment. Years later, several independent researchers claimed to have encountered Armstrong in private settings. In these off-the-record conversations, he neither denied nor dismissed the accounts. In fact, he appeared deeply reserved and is even said to have quietly remarked, "They don't want us there." Even more unsettling was an incident that occurred on the third day of the mission, as the spacecraft was still en route to the moon. Armstrong had requested Houston to verify the exact location of the Saturn V's third stage, the booster that had been jettisoned earlier. 3 minutes later, Mission Control responded. The booster was over 6,000 miles behind them. What followed next was silence, broken only by a terse update from Buzz Aldrin. The two astronauts had been observing a cylindrical object, glowing faintly at one end, trailing alongside their craft in parallel motion. NASA would later suggest that the object was likely a panel or fragment from the discarded booster, but Armstrong remained unconvinced. And ever since, the story of that silent companion has persisted, one of the many enigmatic fragments that continue to cloak the Apollo 11 mission in a veil of inexplicable haze. We can easily believe in the grandeur of that first step, but perhaps because that moment was so monumental, it cast a shadow over a question that has never truly been answered. What if the greatest thing humanity has ever done was also the first time we were being watched? Part 7. The Silenced. The deaths of those who dared to speak the truth. In stories of space and the unknown, there are two kinds of people the world tends to forget. The first are those who stand behind the curtain, never honored, never seen in headlines, yet responsible for processing the photographs, data, transmissions, and life-critical footage from every mission. The second are those who once heard or saw something they were never meant to know. And somewhere in the shadows where these two paths cross, we find the first name, Bob Dean. A former command sergeant major in the United States Army, Bob served for years at various American military bases across Europe throughout the 1960s. He was not a scientist. He was not an astronaut. But according to his own words, he once read a classified dossier titled An Assessment, a top-secret NATO evaluation of potential threats from extraterrestrial entities. In numerous interviews over the years, Bob Dean claimed to have seen photographs taken during the Apollo missions, images that were never released to the public. According to him, these were reels of film that NASA deliberately destroyed, over 40 in total, he said, containing images of strange metallic structures, unnatural surface anomalies, and what he described as clear evidence of intelligent activity on the surface of the moon. Bob once gave a bitter smile when he said, "NASA? It should stand for never a straight answer." Less than a week after he passed away of old age, another event occurred, this time not a natural death. On October 11th, 2018, Bob Dean died peacefully at his home in Tucson, Arizona. 6 days later, in a small town in upstate New York, police responded to a report of a tragic accident. A 74-year-old man had been struck and killed by a reversing tractor while riding his bicycle. The victim's name was Carl Wolf. At first glance, Wolf's death appeared to be nothing more than a tragic accident. But when UFO investigators and conspiracy researchers reviewed his background, something immediately chilled them to the bone. Carl Wolf was not only a former United States Air Force sergeant, he was the first person to publicly claim he had seen photographs of an alien city located on the far side of the moon. In 1965, Wolf had been stationed at Langley Air Force Base, assigned to repair optical equipment used in lunar reconnaissance. One day, he was called to a remote facility where a NASA technician needed help with a malfunctioning image processor. While repairing the device, Wolf accidentally caught sight of a series of printed photographs, data captured from a lunar orbiter. What he saw, according to his own account, were sharp towers, domes, mushroom-shaped buildings, all resting silently in the shadows of the moon's dark side. He said nothing at the time, but more than 30 years later, he stood before a national press conference, alongside over 20 former military and intelligence officials, and revealed everything. And then, he was run over by a tractor in a quiet village on a dry day. No camera footage, no reliable witnesses, and of course, no expanded investigation. 2 deaths, 2 men who had served their country, 2 testimonies that echoed each other with eerie precision, and just days apart. Was it coincidence? Was it fate? Or perhaps, was it the final reminder that some truths were never meant to be spoken aloud? Part 8. The Moon. The outer shell of something that has never been named. For decades, the moon has remained where it always has, silently circling the Earth with a rhythm so perfect it borders on the unnatural. Since ancient times, humanity has gazed up and given it names soaked in poetry. But as our technology brought us closer, the moon began to shed its mystique. It no longer appeared as a canvas for dreams, but as a question no one could truly answer. Not just the shadowy figures on distant ridges, not just the silent objects that floated alongside spacecraft, not even the metallic structures described, then erased, from official records, but something far stranger. An unsettling possibility. What if the moon isn't natural at all? Some independent researchers have proposed a theory, one that may sound implausible, yet is backed by a chain of strange, undeniable data points. They call it the hollow moon hypothesis. The idea that the rocky surface we see is merely an outer shell, encasing something vast and artificial, an ancient space station, or perhaps a dormant vessel lying in wait. In the 1970s, seismometers left behind during the Apollo missions continued to record activity on the lunar surface. In late 1972, as part of a technical experiment, the ascent stage of Apollo 12's module was deliberately crashed into the moon to study the resulting seismic response. What scientists didn't expect was that the moon rang like a bell. The instruments recorded reverberations that echoed for hours, a low, steady hum that spread outward, as though some enormous cavity beneath the surface had resonated in response. NASA later explained that the phenomenon could be attributed to the moon's unique geological composition. But to proponents of the artificial satellite theory, this wasn't the sound of rock. It was the signature of metal. They point to anomalies in the moon's orbit, its unusual density, its perfect rotational lock with Earth, and especially the fact that one side of the moon has never turned to face us, a near impossibility if left to natural celestial mechanics. Add it all together, the strange sounds, the formless shadows, the unidentified objects, the uninhabited structures, and the voices silenced forever. And the theory begins to feel less like fiction and more like an uncomfortable truth. The moon, they suggest, may not be ours, and perhaps it was never meant to be. What you've just heard may be nothing more than speculation, or perhaps they are scattered fragments of truth, blurred by time, politics, and fear. But whatever the case may be, the moon will continue to orbit the Earth silently, as it has for millions of years, and perhaps still watching us from above. What do you think of these theories? If something here made you pause or reminded you of a story you've heard before, leave a comment below. I'd love to read your thoughts and explore more mysteries with you. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the journeys still ahead, where together we'll delve deeper into the unanswered and uncover the kinds of truths that only the dark remembers. Thank you for staying with us until the end. And hopefully, next time, we'll still be on the same side of the moon.